Hey everyone, I want to talk to you about a very hot topic at the moment. It's about this book called Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. Candace Owens is talking about it all the time. She even has like a book club because of this book. Joe Rogan had the author on his show at once, and Ian Carroll has also mentioned this book a couple of times. And it's actually very relevant to what's going on right now, especially with the JFK files and also this little rumor gossip about RFK Jr. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a mind map that I created just to like summarize and like show you some of the most important points of the book. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see everything while I talk about it. And like I try to record a video talking about like the whole thing, but it's not gonna work. So this is like the mind map, and I really don't want this to be like too long. So I'm just going to show you parts of it, and I'm happy to share the mind map, but it's I want to make the connections. I want to show you the connections that this book makes with the CIA, Hollywood, and a little bit of the 60s. And also, if there's enough time, I will show you something else. I'll show you the CIA's response to the book. On their website, on the CIA's website, there is a response to this book. So I'm going to talk to you about it, okay? All right, let's start with the most important, well, not the most important, but you need to know who the author is, right? Tom O'Neill, the author of this book. He used to work for a magazine in the 90s, and he was in charge of writing the 30-year anniversary of the Manson murders that happened in the 60s. He never actually got to finish to write the article and publish it on time because he was investigating so well that he actually got way too much information, and the magazine was just like, okay, keep going, keep working on it, and we'll see what we get. So it's important to remember the setting, right? Like what was happening in the 60s, and we had the civil rights movement, we had race wars, the Vietnam War and anti-war movement, Cold War tensions, and the most important things that I feel that happened and shaped the world after that, and probably, how we live today, is the political assassinations. JFK, RFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. Okay. So the murders, Charles Manson had a family of hippies, right? They're all like their friends. They met in San Francisco. They all use a lot of drugs and they live together. So they're called the family. And then on August 8, 1969, four of the family members, they went to a house on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, and they killed four people that were in the house at that night. One was Sharon Tate, who was this very famous actress, and she was 8 months pregnant. So it was like a horrible, horrible crime because they killed her in a horrible way, like stabbing her, and she was pregnant. And there were three other people in the house. Jay Sebring, which was her ex-boyfriend, but also a hairstylist, and this guy called Frykowski, and his girlfriend, who were coming down of a 10-day mescaline trip. And the next day, they went on and killed La Bianca family, also here in Los Angeles. And so the motive that the trial gave for the murders is that a music producer named Terry Melcher used to live in that house, Cielo Drive. And remember this name, Terry Melcher, he's very, very important. He was a music producer at a time. And it seemed that he promised Charles Manson that he was going to record him. And eventually he didn't. And so Charles Manson was very angry at him and went to the house and with the intent to kill Terry Melcher, but Terry Melcher didn't live there anymore. He secretly moved out, and 3 months later, Sharon Tate moved in. So that's the motive that they give for the reason why Charles Manson and the family killed Sharon Tate. Okay, so because I don't want to make this too long, I'm not going to go over all of this, but this is like just a little bit of the information of how much Tom O'Neill dedicated to investigating this case. He went through the police department, the sheriff department from Los Angeles. He talked to people who worked at that time in the 60s who were involved in the case, but he then also talked to people who came after and people during the 90s. And some of them were really nice and gave him the key to the storage with all the original documents and paperwork from the case. So he actually went through a lot. He talked to a lot of people from like the mob and people from the Hollywood scene, and it's incredible how much information he got. Okay, so let's go to talking about Hollywood. Okay, because we need to know a little bit of the Hollywood gossip. So in 1968, 1 year before the murders, Manson's connection to Hollywood started when some of the girls were hitchhiking on the PCH. PCH, this famous road on the California coast that goes through Malibu that unfortunately had the whole fire happened, and it was right there. So Janice Wilson from the Beach Boys picked up the hitchhike girls and brought them to his house. The girls later on brought themselves back to Wilson's house with Manson and their lifestyle of sex and drugs. So girls are hitchhiking, and famous guy from a band in Hollywood comes, picks them up, takes them to his house in Malibu, have some fun, and then all of a sudden, girls later show up, hey, we're here, look who we brought, our friend Charles Manson. So they had like this whole amazing time with a lot of sex, drugs, and that's where they met the producer Terry Melcher. After some time, Wilson from the Beach Boys was tired of paying the bills, endless parties, foods, clothes, car repairs, and even gonorrhea treatment. But he was so afraid to tell Charles Manson and the girls to leave that he decided to leave his own house. He just like, okay, I can't tell my friends, hey guys, can I have some time? Can you guys like come back later? So he decided to leave his own house. He moved out secretly. Nobody knew. And Terry Melcher, still had this contact with Manson. He's even said to have been in their ranch because the family and Manson, they lived in a ranch here in Los Angeles, and so it's said that Melcher actually went to their ranch and checked out the music and talked to them and had some fun there. So Hollywood gossip. Hollywood became somber. People were scared to party and use drugs after the murders, right? So Sharon Tate dies in a brutal way in her own house, and that's the house that probably had like endless house party. It's Hollywood, it's a mansion, and the most famous people go there, and you can tell that also because the guy who died there, Frykowski, he was heavily involved with the drug trade. And he was coming down from a 10-day mescaline trip. So that tells you a lot, right? Of like the environment that was that was in the house. But nobody wanted to talk about what had happened, not even 30 years later. Remember, Tom O'Neill is investigating what happened in the 60s, but this is in the 90s. In the 90s, he's investigating what happened in the 60s. So he's like talking to people who were famous at the time and used to be friends with Sharon Tate and whatever. Nobody wants to talk. The Cielo Drive house had many parties and recorded S&M movies. During the investigation, the police found a sex tape of Sharon Tate with two men filmed by Polanski at Cielo's house. So the police actually found the tape, and I believe they didn't mention this tape in trial at all. And the tape was Sharon Tate pregnant, having sex with two men, and this was being filmed by her husband, Roman Polanski, who is still alive today. So when I heard that, I couldn't believe it. Sharon Tate is like this incredible image of this actress, and then when you imagine the situation of the things that were happening in that house, it's kind of crazy. So maybe not Charles Manson wasn't like the only crazy weirdo there. Okay, so the Beach Boys. None of the surviving band members wanted to talk to O'Neill, but some of the managers did. The manager at the time, John Parks, said Melcher recorded Manson. But things started to take a dark turn. Many threats from Manson. And the Hollywood community all suspected Manson killed Sharon Tate at Cielo, but nobody wanted bad press. Parks said the FBI came to the Beach Boys' office soon after the murders. They were monitoring their phones, but never shared any information. Parks said that he told the FBI early on about Manson, but the FBI didn't act on this tip. So a lot of people from Hollywood actually told O'Neill that they told the police that they thought, maybe it was this creepy guy, Charles Manson, but the police only talked about the suspects of the murder 3 months later. So the murders happened early August, and the suspects were announced in the media and then caught later on in October. So it took them a really long time to get to Manson, even though they had, like, imagine this, the FBI comes to the Beach Boys studio. That means that they're really looking into this case. And even after many people saying that maybe it was Charles Manson, the FBI still didn't, do much about it. So that's like something to think about. All right, so I want to go, before we talk about the CIA, I do want to talk a little bit about Charles Manson because we're really, fast to go to, oh, this was a crazy guy who just decided to kill them. And especially with the motive that the trial gave, that he was so mad that the producer didn't want to record him. So he went and to the house and tried to kill the producer, ended up killing other people who were in the house. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about his life, okay? Because I thought this was really, really interesting. He was born in Ohio, November 12, 1934, to a 16-year-old mother. He never met his father. His mother was in prison for 7 years during his childhood. He was 8 when she came out. That means that he was 1 year old when she went to jail. And if I'm not mistaken, he was living a little bit with his grandparents. But then he was made ward of the state and was sent to a boys' Catholic-run school, which he ran away from. He was then sent to a correctional facility, which he ran away from there too. And at age 13, he was sent to another boys' school in Indiana, where he claims he was raped. Here he learned how to pretend lunacy and craziness. He ran away 13 times in 3 years. And this part is actually important that they say that when he was 13, he learned how to pretend that he was crazy. And I thought that was a really interesting observation because everything we see about him, it looks like he's crazy. So could he be pretending since he knows how to pretend so much since he was 13? And at 16, he ran away again, stole a car, and crossed state lines, committing a federal offense, and therefore was sent to the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C. He went to a couple more places in different states where many bad incidents had been reported, such as rape, antisocial behavior, and psychotic trauma. He was finally released in 1954 at age 20. In less than a year, he had a wife, and she was pregnant. He had jobs, but he couldn't get rid of the habit of stealing cars and crossing state lines. He got another 3-year sentence in Terminal Island, a federal prison in San Pedro, California. By the time he got out in 1958, his wife had filed a divorce. Due to pimping, stealing cars, and crossing to Mexico while on probation, he got another 10-year sentence. This guy was in jail all his life. He was 32 when he came out. More than half of his life was in the care of the state. So that's another important thing. This guy, he was in the care of the state all his life. And he basically didn't have a mom. He never had a father figure. And the worst of all is that at 13 years old, these horrible things happen to you as a boy. And yeah, I cannot imagine what kind of state of mind this guy was in. So in 1967, when he came out, he was 32 years old, and he goes to San Francisco, where the epicenter of the hippie movement during the Summer of Love was happening. That was in Haight-Ashbury, and it was very chaotic and full of hippies. The streets were filled with music, free clinics, communal crash pads, and LSD-fueled gatherings. So he began like meeting these hippies. He started to look like a hippie, and they started doing lots of drugs, and he became like a leader for a lot of these hippies. And I'm going to talk to you now about his life in the ranch, which was also like, I think there's like movies now, that you can watch and see a little bit of that. But um, the family was a group of like 20 to 30 hippies, and they all lived together in this ranch. And their food, because they're hippies, they don't work, right? They don't have money, they don't work, they're on drugs. And you have to wonder, where does food come from? And where does where do the drugs come from? Like you have to have drugs for 30 people, excuse me, every day. Where do these drugs come from? They cost, right? They do. So, but this is the crazy part. Food came from dumpster diving trips. Do you know what a diving trip is? Some of the family members, they get together, they get in the car, they go to the city, they go to like the alley of a restaurant where the trash can is and of grocery stores, and they get food from the trash can. So they bring all the food that they gather from the trash, they bring it back home, they cook like a family meal, and they eat food that's like leftovers that they found in the trash. How crazy is that? Their days were filled with drugs, LSD, marijuana, and speed, and lots of music. LSD played a central role. Manson used it to manipulate and program his followers, and I'll talk about that right now. He guided them through the experience, reinforcing his authority, and sex and orgies were frequent, and Manson encouraged free love as a way to break societal norms. So, what about this programming? In order for you to get rid of societal programming in your mind and have a new way of seeing life, you need to first start with getting rid of the program that your parents did to you. So first step is create a new identity. So every member of the family had new names and weren't allowed to talk about their personal lives, neither contact their family. So we're all brand new people in this place, and we don't talk about who we really are, and we don't tell our parents, we don't tell our family where we are, we don't talk to them, and we don't talk to each other about them. And any sexual resistance meant they weren't freed from their parents' programming. So after we eat food from the trash, Manson gives us some drugs, and then he starts organizing and coordinating what everyone is going to do. We're about to have this orgy going on, and he's like telling you, go with this person, you do this, you do that. I'm imagining that's how it went. And if you resisted to do any of the things he's telling you to do or to let be done to you, then that means that you still have your parents' programming in your mind. So everything that you think is right or wrong, good and bad, all of that needs to go because it's a new life, right? And I think that's pretty insane. Manson would make psychological mind control and reprogram his followers while he would not take LSD. Their LSD sessions would go on for days with no breaks. Every experience led the family to drift further from reality until eventually even basic contradictions seemed tenable. So death was the same as life, good was no different from bad. And that's really important actually because when the girls get caught by the police and they talk about, what does it mean to you? What did you feel when you stabbed Sharon Tate 100 times in her belly with the baby inside? Oh, I just think she was being reborn, like she was like like dying is the same thing as being born again. So pretty crazy. And even scientists give a lot of explanation on this. They analyze them and they say they were completely out of it because you know what? They took drugs almost every day. Like, you know what it's like to take LSD every single day? And I'm not going to talk about a very important part. Everything is important, right? But like, there's a part here that talks about this guy called Morehouse, and he used to live in the Cielo Drive house between Melcher and Sharon Tate. So Melcher moved out, Sharon Tate moved in 3 months later, but in between one going out and one moving in, this guy named Morehouse lived there, and he had a really good connection with Manson. And this thing is that this is not mentioned in the trial. The trial is just says Melcher moved out, Sharon Tate moves in, but nobody talks about how a guy named Morehouse lived there and had LSD trips with Manson, 400 of them throughout I think it was like 4 years, which means that at least in that period that he was living in that specific house, they had a couple of LSD trips together. And Morehouse had a 15-year-old daughter who became part of the family. So it's like this part is not even mentioned in the trial. And why is this important? Because it discredits the motive. If the motive for the killing of Sharon Tate is that Manson was so angry at Melcher that he had to go back to that house and kill him, but then he wasn't there and they just proceeded with killing whoever else was in the house, how do you explain the fact that Manson knew that, that Morehouse lived there and visited Morehouse? Like some strange things. So we talked about this, about who Charles Manson is. And let's go to the fun part, the CIA part. Okay. So there are three important people that we're going to talk about, and we're going to start, actually there are four people. We're going to start with Reeve Whitson. So Reeve Whitson is this character that Hollywood knows. Everybody around Sharon Tate knew this guy, but he was like very secretive, and people thought that he did work for the CIA because he was just like in the corner or whatever. But even Sharon Tate's family knew him. Like supposedly he was a very good friend of Polanski. So he was always around. And a strange thing that happens is that Sharon Tate had a photographer named Hatami, and Reeve Whitson called Hatami the night that the murder happened, and discussed the murder with Hatami before it went public. And Reeve Whitson is this character that convinces Hatami to say to the police that he saw Charles Manson somewhere in the house at some point. And they testify. And then nobody knows what happened to this Reeve Whitson. He just disappears completely. But Tom O'Neill, he goes further. He actually investigates and talks to his Reeve Whitson's ex-wife and to other people. So it's a mystery. Nobody really knows who he is. But Tom O'Neill, the author, actually ties him to a CIA asset. So remember this name because it's in the CIA's response. And a little bit of the politics that was going on in the 60s is that because there were these wars going on and the anti-war movement and race wars, CIA and FBI, they all started some intelligence operations, such as the CIA started Chaos and FBI started COINTELPRO, which were some kind of like surveillance of their own citizens in America. And the objective of these surveillance and intelligence operations was to see if there was communist infiltration in universities because there was like so many riots going on, and so they were trying to investigate undercover why these riots were happening at UC Berkeley, for example. And that's why this connection with Reeve Whitson in with Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski was going on, and why did he disappear after Manson got caught, And also the book makes a very, very strong connection of Polanski with being like a Polish spy. And he and there was a story that when that Roman Polanski was in England when the murder happened. So when he came back to LA after the murder, he actually, right before going to his own house and checking on everything, his wife just died. He actually stopped at a diner like Denny's, and he met this guy Kazakovsky or something. I won't remember the name. And they're basically like the mob, like drug related people. So there's a little bit of conspiracy in that. And okay, so now let's talk about Roger Smith. We're going to talk about two Smiths, Roger Smith and David Smith. So Roger Smith was Charles Manson's former parole officer in San Francisco. He was also okay, so I'm going to read this because it's just good information here. Roger Smith was Manson's former parole officer in San Francisco. After he left the job, he remained in contact with Manson, acting as his guardian. He adopted Manson's child, Michael Valentine. He visited the family and helped get them out of jail, including with bail money for a case before the Tate LaBianca. So he was heavily involved with Charles Manson's private life after jail, after he came out of jail, and even when Roger Smith was not a parole officer anymore. So what made Smith so inclined to treat Manson like a harmless hippie rather than a dangerous ex-con? Think about it. So this guy was in jail all his life and you have a good connection with him. What's that all about? You adopt his son? That's weird. I think it's weird. In spring 1967 to summer 1969 in Haight-Ashbury, Dan Manson becomes a different man. He arrived there as an ex-con and left a confident long-haired cult leader. He began to use LSD, and where he learned to attract weak, susceptible people. Roger Smith was an officer and also a student at UC Berkeley School of Criminology. Manson was assigned to Smith through an experimental parole program called the San Francisco Project, funded by the National Institution of Mental Health. While Smith has a duty as Manson's parole officer, he was also doing research on how drugs, especially amphetamines, made people violent and if it could be controlled. So look at this. So he was, first of all, Manson's parole officer, and then he gets fund from governmental institution, to do this project that analyzes people's mental health after drug use and if they can be controlled. Now let's talk about David Smith. He was the charismatic creator of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. Manson and the family rented an apartment right around the corner and spent a lot of time at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. At 26, David Smith was a postdoctoral student in UC San Francisco and the chief of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Screening Unit at San Francisco General Hospital. I was injecting white rats with LSD in the lab, he said. And then I'd walk home past the Haight, where I'd see kids who were high on the same substance. So he opened the free clinic on 558 Clayton Street. In 1971, David Smith published Love Needs Care. So 1971 is 2 years after the murders happened. David Smith published Love Needs Care, where he talks about all the times he saw and treated Manson and the girls. He also mentioned Manson's tactics for reprogramming and how acid was necessary. When Roger Smith, the other Smith, joined forces with the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, he was picking up where David left off. But this time, the research involved people. This meant that both Smith and Manson were often in the same place at the same time, with both Smith receiving funds from a federal institution, later revealed to be a CIA front. Neither Smith were called to testify on trial for the murders that happened less than a year later. And Bugliosi, the DA who prosecuted Manson, also seemed to not think they were important enough for his book Helter Skelter. Bugliosi, the DA who prosecuted Manson, wrote a book called Helter Skelter where he talked about the whole trial and made his millions of dollars. He didn't think none of these guys were important enough to talk to him, like to understand what's up with the drugs, And so very curious here. These guys, they receive funding from the government, from CIA, and they're treating Manson. Manson was this guy that was always taken care of by the state. And all of a sudden he becomes, this horrible killer as a hippie. And now, last but not least, Jolly West and mind control. This name is very important because it connects with the JFK files, okay? In the JFK files, we will probably see his name. While researching more about the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, O'Neill came across another researcher that had an office there. His name was Dr. Louis Jolyon West, aka Jolly West. David Smith had invited Dr. West to collaborate in research and experiment on mind control with drugs and hypnosis. Jolly West researched methods of controlling human behavior at Cornell University. During the Korean War, he helped deprogram returning prisoners of war who'd been brainwashed. Allegedly, through the 50s and 60s, West performed experiments on unwitting subjects using LSD and hypnosis at a force base in Texas and Oklahoma. And the book has like a whole chapter about this. This is like too much information to go over, but like I'm just making this connection for you that the book, Tom O'Neill goes in depth about this guy and his experiments and all this thing that like some weird stuff that happened in this base and force base in Texas and Oklahoma. O'Neill followed the money. Dr. West had gotten a grant from the government, moved to San Francisco, and changed his look to blend in with the hippies. He gave UCLA all of his accomplished work about the 60s, LSDs, and the hippies. Jolly West's projects and drug-related research in San Francisco had been funded by Sidney J. Gottlieb, the head of the CIA's MK-Ultra program. West experimented with LSD on patients a decade before David Smith had experimented on rodents. So when we hear these stories, we think that the 60s is when we started, experimenting LSD on people and trying to control their minds and making them do things. But as we know, Jolly West is a scientist that had already been doing that before, like a decade or more before that. And there are many stories about him here. So, John F. Kennedy. JFK was assassinated in November 1963. Jolly West psychiatrically examined Jack Ruby, who had murdered Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, not long before Ruby was due to testify for the Warren Commission. So JFK gets killed by this guy named Oswald. And Oswald gets killed by this guy named Jack Ruby, which we just found out that wasn't really his name, like some kind of short name. West examined Ruby alone in his jail cell. West reported that Ruby had suffered an acute psychotic break. Later on, West was requested by a judge to examine Ruby again and help him regain his memory on what had happened during the assassination. But West announced that Ruby was totally insane, agreed by other psychiatrists. And I just want to say that this has happened a couple of times in history, and we have to be able to see when they're happening. And one of the very, very recent times that something very similar happened is in Brazil with ex-President Bolsonaro. He got stabbed by a guy. Luckily, Bolsonaro didn't die, but the guy was insane. They said, oh, he's insane. He cannot speak for himself. There's, he just did it for whatever reason. And, so these things keep happening. Through the 70s, journalists linked West to the CIA's mind control research program MKUltra. He denied all involvement. West died in 1999 and spent the last decade of his career at UCLA heading the psychiatry. Okay, so that's it for the connections I want to make to the book, and I promise you there are many, many more. There is a lot of information that makes this book credible. Okay, you cannot, it took Tom O'Neill 20 years to finally publish something about all his investigation. The magazine that he was working for in the 90s closed down, wasn't even there anymore and he was still investigating it. He was obsessed with this whole thing. So now let's go to the CIA's response. This is the letter. You can find it at their webpage, and it's reviewed by Leslie C., who is like an agent from the CIA. And I have here a couple of points that I thought was worth reading to you. So the CIA response letter: authors or their agents and publishers seem unable to resist using the word secret to modify that apparently pedestrian word history. Chaos is not, at least not in the way its title suggests, a secret history of the 60s. With its fascinating allusions to a host of Southern California characters from Cass Elliot to the Beach Boys, it is more Once Upon a Time in Hollywood than Manchurian Candidate. All of this is straightforward. However, O'Neill's research uncovered a lot of problems and unanswered questions about the conduct of the investigation that might, had they been brought to light sooner, have justified a retrial. O'Neill dwells into the FBI COINTELPRO and CIA's Chaos domestic surveillance program designed to infiltrate, discredit, and neutralize civil rights students and anti-war organizations that first Lyndon Johnson and then Richard Nixon regarded as subversive. These programs, which in the case of CIA violated its charter, were ultimately exposed and triggered congressional hearings in the mid-1970s, in which the intelligence community was held to account. And this is where O'Neill ultimately falls short. Despite what his title implies, he cannot document any compelling link between these programs and Manson. This was not for lack of effort. Extensive research and a slew of FOIA requests did not produce a smoking gun or much beyond the shadowy, ill-explained presence around these events of Reeve Whitson, an alleged intelligence operative. O'Neill also examined the CIA program MKUltra, which may have gotten him closer to his goal, but not much. Conceived by Richard Helms and authorized by Alan Dulles in 1953, MKUltra studied mind control, one possible path to which was hallucinogenic drugs. The standard histories of the subject indicate that the CIA through MKUltra spent considerable effort to understand the use and effects of LSD and other substances, and contracted with a number of researchers to that end. One was Dr. Louis Jolyon West, who is the closest O'Neill gets to tying Manson to the CIA. There's no evidence the two ever met, or that Manson was, in what O'Neill admits is the most far-out theory, the product of an MK Ultra effort to create assassins who would kill on command. O'Neill's narrative is never uninteresting. His research has raised legitimate questions about the investigation and prosecution of these notorious crimes and the actions of a number of people, from the district attorney's office to the sheriff's department. However compelling his determination to follow every last thread, O'Neill has not written a secret history of the 60s. The author cannot definitively tie Manson to MK Ultra or chaos. He can only imply it on circumstantial evidence. At least in the end, he has the grace to acknowledge it. And that is actually true. O'Neill's, he cannot prove it, and he admits it, but it's it's already enough. It's a lot of evidence. It's a lot of connections. And, there was a part of the book that mentions paperwork being destroyed at those clinics. He talked to former employees of the clinics who could swear that they've met there all together. There's a lot. So unless he made up this whole big story to convince us of something, but still, you can still go after all his references. Anyways, I hope you liked it. And if you want this map, I can surely provide it. And yeah, thank you so much for watching.